The American Old West was not the romantic frontier we see in movies. It was a hard, unforgiving place where a single bad decision could mean hunger, illness, or never seeing another sunrise. Long before modern conveniences, folks heading west had to rely on grit, experience, and a handful of hard-earned survival lessons passed down through trial and error. In this video, we'll explore 9 essential tips folks use to survive the American Old West, revealing how ordinary people managed to endure one of the toughest chapters in American history. Which survival tip surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. If you enjoy true Old West history, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into frontier life, legendary figures, and the harsh realities behind the myths. American history is filled with memorable figures, but few eras capture the imagination quite like the period when settlers pushed westward. From the early 1800s through the turn of the 20th century, families, prospectors, and laborers traveled into unfamiliar territory in search of opportunity, often facing conditions far harsher than anything most people experience today. Popular films, especially classic westerns, have certainly romanticized life on the frontier. Yet historical records, diaries, and newspaper accounts suggest that reality was not dramatically different from the stories passed down over time. Daily life demanded constant effort, adaptability, and practical knowledge, from securing food and water to maintaining equipment and navigating long distances with limited resources. Many of the skills essential to frontier survival have faded as modern conveniences took their place. Looking back at what settlers had to master raises an interesting question. How well would someone today cope under those same conditions? Examining the necessities of frontier life offers a clearer understanding of just how resourceful people had to be, and invites us to consider whether we'd manage as well if placed in their boots. Pack a saddlebag full of essentials. A basic fire-starting kit was essential for anyone spending nights on the trail, especially when camps were set up far from towns. Alongside it, travelers carried simple, durable food that could withstand long journeys, such as cornbread or dried beans, usually paired with a small pan or pot for cooking over an open fire. Water was just as critical. A sturdy canteen was rarely left behind, and some also carried spirits, which were commonly used at the time for warmth, morale, or medicinal purposes. Practical tools like a rope or long leather line were included as well, along with extra supplies needed to maintain personal equipment while traveling. For comfort, many rolled up a blanket and secured it with their gear to help ward off cold nights. And if space allowed, a small personal item, often a photograph of a loved one, might be tucked in too, offering a sense of connection during long stretches away from home. Swap stories. Beneath the storytelling, boasting, and friendly exaggeration common among cowhands, there existed a steady exchange of useful knowledge. Conversations along cattle drives, at trail camps, or in frontier towns often served as an informal information network, where experience was shared as freely as stories. This practical guidance could be invaluable. Knowing which campsites offered shelter from wind, which valleys flooded during certain seasons, or which regions became dangerously dry at particular times of year, helped travelers plan their routes more wisely. Climate awareness was especially important, as sudden changes in weather could slow travel or make certain paths difficult to cross. Reliable water sources were among the most critical pieces of information passed along. Springs, creeks, and watering holes were not always marked on maps, and many were seasonal. Learning where clean water could be found, or where it disappeared during dry months, often made the difference between a manageable journey and serious hardship. Occasionally, these shared tips even included locations where travelers could wash off trail dust, a small comfort that mattered more than it might seem. Historical journals, trail guides, and personal letters consistently show that survival in the Old West depended as much on shared knowledge as on individual toughness. While frontier culture valued independence, it was the quiet exchange of information, passed from one traveler to another, that helped people navigate unfamiliar land and endure the challenges of long-distance travel. Keep a keen eye. Life on the frontier could shift unexpectedly, often with little warning. Because weather forecasts did not exist, travelers learned to read the sky carefully, Subtle changes in cloud height, color, or movement, along with shifts in wind, were often the only signs that rain, cold fronts, or severe storms were approaching. This kind of weather awareness was not guesswork, but a learned skill. Pioneer diaries and trail journals frequently mention watching the sky as part of daily routine. Recognizing these signs allowed travelers to adjust their plans, seek shelter, or avoid routes that could quickly become dangerous during sudden weather changes. Awareness of the surrounding landscape was just as important. Sounds coming from tall grass or brush carried meaning, whether they signaled wildlife, livestock, or other travelers nearby. Learning to interpret these cues helped people remain alert and avoid surprises in unfamiliar terrain. Historical records show that situational awareness was developed quickly out of necessity. Those moving through the Old West could not afford distraction. Survival depended on observation, patience, and the ability to respond calmly to changes in the environment. Skills that became second nature to experienced travelers long before modern technology made such awareness less essential. Always pack heat. Although popular Western films often exaggerate the frequency of barroom scuffles and sudden confrontations, historical accounts suggest that everyday life on the frontier was usually more restrained. Still, travelers and settlers understood that preparedness was essential, especially when moving through remote areas far from towns or help. Firearms were commonly carried not as symbols of bravado, but as practical tools. Figures such as Annie Oakley exemplify how marksmanship was viewed as a skill rooted in discipline and necessity rather than constant conflict. For many on the frontier, keeping a firearm close was simply part of being equipped for unpredictable conditions. Wildlife posed real challenges during westward travel. Predators such as mountain lions, wolves, and bears were well documented in frontier journals and government reports, particularly in the Plains, Rockies, and Western Territories. Animals were often drawn to camps by the smell of food or livestock, making vigilance an everyday concern rather than a rare event. In this context, carrying protective tools was less about confrontation and more about deterrence and self-reliance. The goal was to discourage curious or hungry animals and safeguard supplies that were difficult to replace. Frontier survival depended not on constant danger, but on preparation, awareness, and an understanding of the environment. Skills learned through experience rather than dramatized encounters. Stockpile up at home. Today, most people only think about storing extra supplies when severe weather is forecast or an emergency seems imminent. In contrast, families living in the American Old West treated long-term preparation as a normal part of everyday life rather than a temporary response to a crisis. For frontier households, year-round storage was essential. Isolation, unreliable transportation, and seasonal weather made regular access to goods uncertain. As a result, families worked constantly to ensure they had enough resources to last through winter months, droughts, or periods when travel became impossible. This mindset was shaped by experience. Missed harvests or delayed supply wagons could have serious consequences. Firewood gathering was a continuous task, not a seasonal chore. Wood was needed for cooking, heating, and lighting, and supplies had to be built up well before colder months arrived. Food preservation was equally important. Vegetables harvested in late summer and fall were canned, dried, or stored in root cellars, while meat was often salted or smoked to extend its usefulness without refrigeration. These practices were common across frontier communities and are well documented in homestead records, pioneer journals, and agricultural manuals of the 19th century. Preparation was not driven by fear, but by practicality and self-reliance. Survival in the Old West depended less on dramatic moments and more on steady planning, hard work, and the discipline to think months or even a full year ahead. Know how to tie a knot. Beyond basic daily chores, frontier life demanded a wide range of practical skills. Settlers were expected to repair their own fences, including mending broken wire that kept livestock contained and protected valuable crops. These tasks were ongoing, as weather, animals, and constant use quickly wore down equipment. Livestock care was another central responsibility. Herding cattle, tending animals, and preparing them for food required both physical endurance and practical knowledge. When animals were processed, hides were carefully treated and tanned to produce leather, which was then used for clothing, footwear, tack, and household goods. Very little went to waste, as replacing supplies could be difficult or expensive. Providing food also depended on marksmanship and patience. Rifles were commonly used for hunting game at a distance, supplementing diets that relied heavily on preserved foods. Success required familiarity with the landscape, an understanding of animal behavior, and steady practice, skills learned over time rather than innate talent. Life on the frontier left little room for idleness. Survival depended on adaptability, resilience, and a willingness to face uncomfortable or unfamiliar tasks. Historical records consistently show that the Old West rewarded those who were resourceful and persistent, while those unwilling to work hard or learn new skills often struggled to endure its demands. Rely on community. Once a family chose a place to put down roots, they were rarely alone for long. Frontier settlements often grew quickly as other families with similar goals arrived, drawn by shared resources, fertile land, or access to transportation routes. Over time, these nearby households formed close-knit communities built on necessity as much as companionship. Cooperation was a defining feature of frontier life. Neighbors relied on one another to raise barns, bring in crops, share tools, and exchange knowledge about local conditions. In an environment where professional services were scarce or non-existent, mutual assistance was often the difference between enduring hardship and falling behind. This sense of community became especially important during times of illness or extreme weather. Without easy access to doctors or supplies, families depended on neighbors for care, food, and labor when someone was unable to work. Historical letters, diaries, and homestead records repeatedly emphasize how shared effort helped settlers persevere through difficult seasons. The American Old West was not survived through independence alone. While self-reliance mattered, it was cooperation, trust, and strong social bonds that allowed communities to endure. Frontier life rewarded those who understood that resilience was often a collective effort rather than an individual one. A wild horse could and should be tamed. Frontier travelers did not have the luxury of choosing from a stable of well-trained animals. Horses were often acquired through trade, necessity, or circumstance, and they were not always young, calm, or properly trained. As a result, settlers and cowhands had to make do with whatever animal they could obtain. Working with difficult or inexperienced horses became a practical skill rather than a choice. Learning how to handle, calm, and train an animal was essential for transportation, labor, and daily survival. Historical accounts show that horsemanship on the frontier relied more on patience, consistency, and familiarity than brute force. A dependable horse could mean the difference between isolation and connection to nearby towns or neighbors. For many people today, the idea of taking responsibility for such an animal from scratch is intimidating. Yet for those living in the Old West, adapting to imperfect tools, including unpredictable horses, was simply part of everyday life. It raises an interesting question when looking back. Are there other overlooked survival skills that old cowhands considered second nature, but modern life has allowed us to forget? Remember, sheriffs weren't always trustworthy. In many frontier regions, formal law enforcement was inconsistent or ineffective. Some officials were openly corrupt, others lacked proper training or resources, and many towns were simply too remote to maintain reliable oversight. As a result, ordinary settlers often could not depend on authorities to ensure order or safety in their daily lives. This reality forced individuals and families to rely heavily on their own judgment and preparedness. Survival on the frontier meant learning how to recognize threats early, avoid dangerous situations when possible, and use wit, local knowledge, and community cooperation to stay ahead of trouble. Adaptability and awareness were often more valuable than confrontation. Figures such as Jesse James and Wyatt Earp illustrate how blurred the lines could be between lawlessness and authority in the Old West. James became a symbol of organized outlaw activity, while Earp moved between roles as a lawman businessman, and later a political figure. Their stories reflect a frontier society where power, reputation, and influence were not always clearly defined. Historical records show that the Old West was less about constant conflict and more about navigating uncertainty. People survived not through reckless action, but by learning when to stand firm, when to step aside, and how to function in a world where official systems were still taking shape. Understanding this complexity helps separate the reality of frontier life from the myths that later grew around it. Surviving the American Old West was never about swagger, legend, or the kind of fearless bravado later celebrated in dime novels and Hollywood films. It was about stacking small advantages every single day, learning the land, preparing for seasons months in advance, paying attention to subtle warning signs, and leaning on hard-earned experience rather than hope. The people who made it weren't superhuman. They were disciplined, observant, and relentlessly practical. They understood that survival came from habits repeated daily, storing food long before winter arrived, sharing information with neighbors, reading the sky instead of trusting chance, caring for animals that were essential to daily life, and adapting quickly when plans fell apart. Every tip covered in this list reflects a reality that frontier life demanded constant awareness and effort, not occasional heroics. What's striking when you look closely at these survival strategies is how interconnected they were. Knowing where water could be found meant little if you hadn't learned to read the weather. Storing food mattered only if you also had the skills to preserve it properly. Community ties were just as important as individual self-reliance, because even the most capable person could be laid low by illness, injury, or a failed harvest. Frontier survival was a system, not a single skill, and those who lasted the longest understood that balance. They planned ahead but stayed flexible, worked hard but shared the load, and respected the environment instead of trying to dominate it. These lessons also expose how misleading modern myths about the Old West can be. Life wasn't a constant stream of dramatic showdowns or reckless adventure. More often, it was quiet, exhausting, and repetitive. Days were filled with labor that had to be done whether you felt ready or not. Mistakes weren't learning experiences. They were setbacks that could echo for months. The Old West rewarded patience, foresight, and cooperation far more often than boldness. And while modern life has insulated us from many of these pressures, it has also distanced us from the mindset that made frontier survival possible. Looking back at these essential tips forces a difficult but fascinating question. How well would we actually fare under those conditions? Stripped of instant communication, reliable supply chains, climate control, and emergency services, how many of us could plan far enough ahead, read our surroundings well enough, or work hard enough, day after day, to endure? The people of the Old West didn't survive because the world was kinder then. They survived because they learned to be tougher, smarter, and more prepared than the world demanded. In the end, the true story of the American Old West isn't about taming a wild land. It's about ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges through persistence and adaptability. These 9 essential tips aren't just relics of a bygone era. They're reminders of what human resilience looks like when comfort is stripped away. The frontier may be gone, but the lessons remain.